22,000 at a time when Navan's population was just 5,000, so 4 times the population of Navan came to visit the trade fair that year. 74, €4 million pounds worth of business done, so it was now an event of national significance. But the nomadic nature of the event puts pressures on Navan Chamber of Commerce as the organiser to find a single venue. So the Chamber leads a drive to build major exhibition space for the town's industries. In 1976, Tom Dunn, the president of the Chamber of Commerce, first publicly floats the idea of a national scale exhibition centre in Navan. The cost was $260,000. 100,000 of that was supposed to be raised in Navan. The government pledged 100,000 of a grant and 60,000 was to be borrowed. The money was raised in Navan through all the furniture factories and other businesses like Tar and Mines all came on board. Planning approval was granted in 1980 and the building work starts with Patsy McCabe from Livingston, Dundrum steel from, or no, Dwyer steel from Dundrum, County Tipperary were the two builders. Construction is completed in time for the 81 trade fair opened by Charles Haughey, and it was a hugely impressive venue for a small, relatively small rural town like Navan at the time. It was in fact the biggest exhibition venue outside the RDS in Dublin. And the centre also over the years, in addition, it was built for the trade fairs, but other events happened there as well. Sporting events, Barry McGuigan fought Sally Neck in 1932, 1983, on his way to his world featherweight title a couple of years later. Rock concerts, Status Quo played in 1982. I remember my first rock concert, blew my mind. They actually came back in 1990 and played again. There were election counts, including a marathon, general election counts and a marathon European election count as well, involving Jim Fitzsimons, the local MEP at the time, in 1999. There were show jumping events where all the big names of the era participating, so there was a lot of stuff going on. So the 70s is probably the high point for furniture in Navan. Boyne Mills closes in 1971 after 40 years as the town's biggest factory. But the newer factories are still scattered about in different areas of the town, in old and often unsuitable buildings. Meath County Council had really at that stage wanted to try and get everybody into, or get most of the factories into some kind of a cluster somewhere in Navan, in a more modern setting. And they had bought land at Towns Park in the 1960s with a view to do that. So they developed the Beachmount Industrial Estate, and at that time there were also some IDA grants that were available to companies to build new factories. So the first factory in is the Foster Brothers, followed by Maguna Kitchens, Mick and Matt Maguna, and Brunel follows then. And subsequently, more companies followed subsequent years as that clustering effect takes hold, and Beachmount Industrial Estate then became the focal point of furniture in Navan. There were still lots of other furniture factories around the town, several in Mill Lane, Boyne Road, Kilcarn, Academy Street, lots of different areas. Some of the factories in Beachmount begin to crack the UK market very successfully, and some begin to export to Europe and beyond. Tommy Foster, in the early 1970s, began to import French and Italian reproduction frames, quite elaborate frames, which he upholstered, assembled and polished in Navan. And he actually developed a very successful export line from those. He sold that kind of furniture from places from Iceland to Egypt to Australia. Incredible. And Harrods in London was a customer as well for his Queen Anne chairs. So the 1980s is something of a watershed. Well, not a watershed, it was kind of the time when the beasts of the East started to appear. A very difficult period for the Navan furniture industry, many factory closures. So due to the wholesale importation of cheaper products from the Far East and Eastern Europe. It was also a time of deep recession at home. The Irish economy was moribund at this time. There was very little consumer spending. High rates of VAT on furniture was 25%, soaring interest rates of 19-20%. And that all contributed to the demise of large-scale manufacturing who were attempting to compete with the cheaper imports from the Far East and Eastern Europe. One point that's sometimes forgotten is there was a move away from apprenticeships, which left a bit of a no pipeline of new young people coming through to replace the older guys who were retiring. That stage in the 1980s, it was very much in vogue to go to university, get a college degree. People wanted to work on the new emerging sectors like tech. Unfortunately, apprenticeships took a back seat. So this combination of factors decimated the industry, closing their factories. Tommy Foster was the first to go in 1983, followed a year later by his brother George in 84. Maguna Kitchens went in 1987, Brunel in 89, so once the dominoes started to fall, a lot of them fell. Many of them started up again in smaller, leaner operations and continued for many years. And in fact, furniture manufacturing on a much smaller scale still continues in Navan. In Beachmont Home Park as it is now, there are at least 2 or 3 significantly sized operations making upholstered furniture. Eimear is one, Louis Dungan is another. So don't let anybody tell you that furniture manufacturing in Navan is completely dead. So just a quick recap. Just one factory in 1906 went on to see the multitude. So this organisational chart just shows Navan Sawmill and Furniture Factory was the instigator. Became Good Earls and Aylesbury's, and out of that came people like Bardwell, John Hogg, Moore Brothers, and they went on to seed a whole other generation of furniture factories in the 60s and the 70s. I haven't included Navan Joinery Geraghty's in that because there's no direct line back to Navan Sawmill. That started independently. Okay. Now carpets. So these are the 2 original dream weavers, as I call them. British Army officer Clement Wren Newson, born in Fulham in London, 1894, serves in the Royal Signals in the British Army during World War I. Finishes his army career as an acting captain in the Special Intelligence Branch in Dublin. And that was the reason he moved to Ireland. And just for a bit of context, he married a war widow called Eileen Usher Burke from County Mayo, and they settled in Bow Park. But they had a daughter, Eileen Wren Newson, and Eileen Wren Newson went on to marry Frederick William Cunningham of Slane Castle, and their eldest child is Henry Charles. So Captain Newson is Henry Charles' grandfather. So he moves to Ashfield Bow Park, which is a farm, but he doesn't relish the idea that he's going to be able to provide enough of an income for his family from the farm. So he's looking around for an idea to start an industry, and he hits on the idea of starting a nail manufacturing business at Ashfield. And at that time, the government in Ireland were giving out contracts. They were trying to kickstart indigenous industry, and they were giving out contracts for all sorts of businesses. So he went to the authorities, the Department of Industry and Commerce, with something for a nail factory, and they turned around to him and said, sorry, that option has already been taken up by somebody else. But they told him there was an option to make ladies' handbags or carpets, neither of which he knew anything about. But he was an entrepreneur if he was nothing else, and he decides to opt for the latter, and he goes back to the department, gets sufficient official documentation to enable him to set up a carpet factory, and then heads to Scotland in 1936 to the Templeton Carpet Factory in Glasgow. Now at that time, Templeton Carpets were the foremost luxury carpet maker in all of the UK. They were pretty much the leading carpet manufacturer in the UK. They had provided the carpets for all the royal coronations in the 1900s, up to and including Queen Elizabeth II in the 1950s. They carpeted the House of Commons, the White House in Washington, all the luxury liners of the early era like Titanic and Queen Mary. So they were really serious players. So he travels to there in 1936, strikes up a friendship with Robert McLean, which is the man on the right. He was a management trainee in the early stage. By the time Newsom met him, he was on a fast track towards becoming a senior partner in the place. But somehow they both convinced this major furniture manufacturing concern in Scotland to back their idea of starting a carpet factory in a rural Irish town. How they did it, I have absolutely no idea, but they did. So there's a site of 5 acres acquired on the Cows Road from James Mullen, the proprietor of the Russell Arms Hotel. And the building of Templeton Carpets Limited starts in June 1937 under the direction of Rudolph Maximilian Butler, who was an Irish-German architect, a noted architect in Ireland. He actually designed UCD as part of his portfolio of work. Official opening was by Sean Lemass, the Minister for Industry and Commerce, on 29 September 1938, and the picture is of the address, the formal address, very elaborate address that was presented to Sean Lemass on the day by the directors of the company. The factory kind of started out making chenille carpets, which are small, narrow rugs, and it was a predominantly female workforce. They were trained by experienced Scottish weavers who came over initially. Some engineering staff came over as well, people like George Webster, who ended up being the works manager, Davy Hope, Peter Spears, all of whom were supposed to go back to Scotland after they'd done their initial setup of the looms and all that kind of stuff. But of course the war broke out. They asked for permission to stay, which was granted, and instead of going back after the war ended, they ended up spending their entire lives and careers in Navan Carpets. But the impact of World War II was obviously huge. The factory in Glasgow, the parent factory, was actually was closed and put to war use. So they actually became the largest laundry in Britain. They were washing and cleaning the ship's blankets and hammocks from the huge troop convoys that were coming into and exiting the Clyde. So Templetons in Scotland passed over to Navan all their unfulfilled contracts to finish. When that happened, when that work finished in Navan, because Navan was initially quite busy at the start in the early years of World War II. But then, potential disaster. Templetons decided they're going to close their Navan factory because of the war. Newsom and McLean see the possibility of their dream dying before it's even got into its stride. So again, they used their persuasive powers to convince Templetons to sell their interest in the business to them. Also coming on board for that purchase was Professor Jack A. Nicholson, who was the head of the veterinary faculty in Trinity College. So, World War II, obviously things are quite difficult, there's not a lot happening, but production ramps up after 1945, but remains limited. There was a flight of workers during the war to more secure work, and Newsom attempts to attract them back and incentivise the staff in Navan by increasing wages. And by 1948, the payroll was 120, again, largely women who were weavers. And the 1950s recession obviously bit at the furniture industry. It affected sales, consumers tightened their belt. The factory spent a lot of time during the 50s on short-time working. But despite the problems, the workforce grows to 150 by the end of the decade. And there's one significant purchase that happens in the late 50s, and that's the acquisition of the Selbert spinning mill. That gave Navan Carpets a vital cog in its operation. Its own spinning and dyeing plant, which was necessary. So what they did was they basically took the various blends of wool, mixed it with the nylon in an 80-20 ratio approximately, and then spun it into the 2-ply carpet yarn that could be used by the Navan factory to make the carpets. And by that time, end of the decade, the company is producing about 40,000 yards of carpet and servicing 108 retailers around the country. Like the furniture, swinging 60s was a time to shrug off the austerity in the previous decade and start-upping outward. Clement Newson dies in 1962, having retired a couple of months previously. And a Yorkshire man by the name of Alan Mallinson is appointed as the managing director. Mallinson was a Yorkshire man who had worked as a senior executive with the Stoddard and Company carpet manufacturers in Scotland, which is the other large company alongside Templeton's. He was also a lecturer in Leeds University. So he spearheads a push into the UK. It's a market he would have known anyhow himself quite well. British sales team is appointed, and facilities at Haywood near Manchester are acquired, offices and a large warehouse. In September '64, the first bulk export of Wilton and Axminster carpet is dispatched to the UK. And pretty much every week to 10 days after that, there was a shipment of carpets leaving Navan for Delaney to go to Haywood to service the UK market. 1964, there's new showrooms open in Dublin, Cork and Belfast as the company expands. And then in London in 1965, a new showroom opened, prestigious address in Condor House in the shadow of St Paul's Cathedral in London. And that was all basically had to build the brand and get it known in both countries. Mallinson then sets his sights on Europe, in particular West Germany, France and the Netherlands. And in 1967, Navan carpets were being showcased at exhibitions in Frankfurt, London and Amsterdam. By now it's Navan's biggest employer with 250 staff. Productivity trebles, first night shift starts, and there's a big factory extension of 10,000 square feet opened in 1967. Late 60s is a period of huge growth for the company, and it's exporting half its production to the UK and Europe. It wins the Irish Exporter of the Year award in '66, invests largely in new broad loom